Today, we're digging into the really extraordinary life of a figure whose story was just, well, a real saga. Immense influence, public scandal, and this incredible persistence. We are talking about the U.S. televangelist Jimmy Swaggart. He passed away recently, June 15th, at the age of 90 after a heart attack.
Yeah, and our mission today really is to unpack that story, the incredible rise of this media empire he built on faith, but also its pretty dramatic downfall because of personal scandal, and yet somehow this resilience that let him keep preaching right up until his final days.
Right.
And we're pulling this all together from recent news reports that cover his life and his passing, just to give you the clearest possible picture of what's really a complex legacy.
Okay, let's get into it then. Jimmy Swaggart, you really have to see him as a pioneer, don't you? In televangelism, I mean. He started broadcasting sermons way back in the 1960s, practically invented the whole thing for a global audience.
Absolutely. And he had this very specific self-description, didn't he?
He did. He called himself an old-fashioned, Holy Ghost-filled, shouting, weeping, soul-winning, gospel-preaching preacher.
Quite the mouthful.
It is. But what did that actually look like when he was, at his peak?
Well, the scale, that's what's really striking about his early influence. I mean, by the 1980s, Swaggart's broadcasts were reaching millions of viewers in 100 countries.
Wow.
And it wasn't just a ministry, it was an economic engine. It was pulling in, get this, $140 million a year.
$140 million. That's pretty staggering. It speaks to his vision, I guess, and his charisma.
Definitely. It was more than just a church operation. It was this sophisticated global media enterprise.
Right, because beyond the TV sermons, he had huge sales from gospel albums and then all the branded merchandise. Everything from Bible study guides to actual replicas of Jesus's crown of thorns.
Yeah, that's the sold. And the sort of spiritual center of it all was that huge 7,000-seat family worship center down in Baton Rouge.
I can only imagine what those services were like. Intense, you described them.
Oh, deeply emotional. You'd see worshipers weeping openly and sometimes speaking in tongues, which, for anyone unfamiliar, that scene is a really profound sign of devotion in the American Pentecostal faith that Mr. Swaggart was part of.
Okay.
And his sermons themselves were incredibly impassioned, often focused on that eternal struggle, good versus evil. And quite pointedly, he preached a lot against what he called the temptations of the flesh.
And that specific theme, that's what makes the next chapter so dramatic, isn't it? Because right at the absolute peak of his influence, 1988, that's when he was photographed in New Orleans with a sex worker. And the whole narrative just completely shifts, a very public reckoning.
The fallout was, well, immediate and incredibly public. And what really stands out is that televised apology. It was just raw. He was tearful, appearing on TV, begging for forgiveness. He actually said to the hundreds of millions that I have stood before, I have sinned against you and I beg you to forgive me. I have sinned against you, my Lord.
Wow. Talk about public contrition on a global scale. And the irony for people watching back then must have been incredibly sharp. Because Swaggart had been, really critical of other big-name preachers, especially if they got caught up in similar scandals.
Very critical. He didn't hold back. And he'd also made some pretty controversial comments about other faiths, too, calling Catholicism and Judaism illegitimate faiths at one point, which didn't exactly win him friends outside his base.
Right. So with that background, how did the sort of wider religious world react when he himself fell so publicly?
The consequences were swift and pretty severe. He was almost immediately kicked out of the Assemblies of God. That's a major ultra-conservative association of Pentecostal churches. Big deal.
Okay.
And some religious networks dropped his programs. His ministry, which, remember, was a huge employer down in Louisiana, it shrank significantly. Dramatically, really. It just highlighted the kind of intense scrutiny these public religious figures are under.
You might have thought that apology in '88, that whole ordeal, maybe that was the end of his public trials, but then just 3 years later, 1991, it happens again.
Yeah. It's kind of unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah.
Caught with a sex worker again, this time out in California. But his response was totally different this time around.
How so?
Well, he was much less apologetic, actually quite defiant. He famously said, the Lord told me it's flat none of your business.
Wow. From tearful repentance to none of your business. That's quite a shift.
It really is. Tells you a lot about maybe his evolving view of public accountability or lack thereof. And on top of that, he also had ongoing legal battles over tax payments, which, drained even more of his resources.
So despite these huge setbacks, these really dramatic public falls from grace and a much smaller operation, he just kept going.
He did.
Continued preaching, running his own broadcast network right up until he died at 90. What does that tell us? That kind of relentless persistence after such public shame?
Well, if you try to connect it to the bigger picture,
Mhm.
Swaggart's life is just this incredible arc, isn't it?
Mm.
He goes from being this global pioneer televangelist to a figure really defined by repeated public scandal.
Mm.
And yet, somehow, he never stopped his core thing, preaching.
Yeah.
And maybe that endurance, it wasn't just like stubbornness. Maybe it shows how, for a certain audience anyway, the perceived sincerity of someone's conviction, even if they have repeated moral failings,
Mm.
can sometimes outweigh the actual transgressions. He sort of
Yeah.
redefined what ministry meant, but purely on his terms, regardless of what anyone else thought.
That's a really powerful point. It kind of challenges how we usually think about legacy and public figures, doesn't it?
Mm.
So, in a world where we're constantly wrestling with public morality versus personal redemption, Jimmy Swaggart's journey stretching over decades, ending with him just quietly continuing his ministry, it really reveals a profound paradox.
Mm.
It shows us that conviction, even when it seems deeply flawed to outsiders, can have this enduring power. It can reshape a legacy, somehow allowing it to persist even after massive scrutiny and these huge public falls. It really makes you think, for you, the listener, what actually
Yeah.
defines true resilience in the end?